Chema Hernandez Gil. He's a union organizer and co-founder and board of director of Seed the Commons, a grassroots organization that works to create sustainable and just food systems that are independent of animal exploitation. Chema was raised vegetarian and experienced his family's shift from eating more dairy and processed foods when they left Mexico in the late 1980s. Along the way, he acquired an understanding of how native North American food systems are colonized. He is passionate about building vegan agroecology food systems within the context of decolonization. Please welcome Chema Hernandez Gil.
Thank you. So I'm really excited about this presentation. This is, in a way, the culmination of a few years of research and work that we've done with the community. And my goal really is to first talk a little bit about urban inequality and see how it's connected to the exploitation of animals and ultimately as food and beasts of burden. And it's something that I knew in a way was connected, but it's really been in the last couple of years that research has really caught up with that. And my goal then is to contrast also the example of indigenous North American civilizations as counterexamples to this urban development and ultimately resilience. I want to start talking, though, about the inequality in San Francisco. It's a great example close by, right? If you live there or if you visit there, it's very easy to be exposed to these gleaming towers of condos worth millions of dollars right next to homeless encampments. According to a 2014 study done by the San Francisco Human Services Agency, the city's Gini Coefficient, it's the most commonly used measurement of inequality, places San Francisco roughly between Rwanda and Guatemala, right? Now, San Francisco might be an extreme form of inequality, but there really is no doubt that it's being experienced by urban areas across the world. And ultimately, this is due to capitalism and imperialism that didn't really appear out of nowhere, right? It seems to be growing. It seems to be growing much more and much faster to larger extremes in places, in urban areas, in cities like San Francisco. Has it always been like that? And this is where it's going to turn a little bit into a history lesson for folks. Hopefully none of this is new, but it might just be a useful reminder. Imperialism led to what's called the settler colonial system here in North America, driven largely by things like white supremacy, capitalism. Imperialism led to this idea of manifest destiny. And that, of course, led to tragic genocides up and down the continent. The end result, though, is that the way the land was organized, the way land was seen by people, changed from being a more collaborative system to an extractive model. And this happened from the 1500s onwards. But I don't want to make it that distant. It's important to remember that in the case of the Bay Area, it wasn't until the late 1770s, roughly when the Declaration of Independence was signed, that you started seeing that change happen here for the first time the Spanish arrived in the Bay Area. Native villages were destroyed to make way for the missions and replaced not by people just yet, largely by cattle and horses. From sea to shining sea, we see European settlers bringing farm animals, cows, pigs, goats, sheep, chickens. And we're not just talking about the old McDonald vision of a small farm, but we're talking about cattle grazing and ranching, really as a central component of settler colonialism. This Bureau of Land Management map shows how much land was reserved in the United States for grazing on public lands, right? This was created and merged by a merger of different institutions and the federal government, but you can see that it's huge, right? It's a huge part of what the United States was. And again, I want to remind folks that it's not something that's so much in the past. Pacific cattle grazing in the frontiers that were related to that really were central to the colonization of the West. The relationship with the land became extractive. And it was ultimately the reason why most of us are here, right? But it's not just old history. This picture right here is a picture of the Bear Ears National Monument, which you might recall a couple of years ago was significantly reduced in size, I believe by 85% by President Trump, despite the opposition of the Bear Ears Intertribal Coalition, the Hopi tribe, the Navajo Nation, the Ute tribe, the Pueblo Zuni, and the Ute Mountain tribe. And it was turned over to grazing, right? So it's very, very recent. In the case of Mexico, right, because we have to acknowledge that the borders we're seeing are very fictitious, or at the very least very recent. It happened as well. My family comes from a small town in central Mexico. One of the largest landowners is Vicente Fox, former chief executive of Coca-Cola, former president of Mexico, whose family came to my town in the late 1800s from Detroit and the Basque Country to essentially be given land, right? So we see this giving away of indigenous land specifically for the purpose of grazing. And some of that land, as decades went on, became mining towns and became oil extraction sites. So we see this process kind of accelerate and go through. And again, I want to emphasize that this is not at all the past, but very much the present. This map right here, some of you might have seen, but it shows the amount of land that is being used for pasture and livestock of feed crops. It's currently about 41%. All that said, very little has changed in the last 150 years in terms of land being reserved for grazing and for cattle. It remains, it was, the central institution of settler colonialism, and ultimately the precedent for a lot of the struggles of today, from opposition to mining to oil extractions. Most of the U.S. land remains in the hands of very few people, and ultimately denying all of us, not just funds, but a solution, a very real solution to climate change. Because all of that land used to be forests and grasslands that would suck up millions and millions of tons of CO2. That ultimately would be the best solution of addressing things like climate change. And we've seen these pictures of these mountains of skulls of bison that led to the west. And some of you might know that this is still happening. Literally thousands of native animals from Yellowstone all the way out to Point Reyes are being slaughtered every year to make way for ranching, to reserve that land for ranching, to ensure that that central component of settler colonialism and inequality remains an ever-present power here in the Bay Area and in the United States and in North America. How does this compare, though, to the situation before colonization? And this is where things, again, become very exciting and where it really, you have to challenge a little bit the preconceptions. Because one of the really, truly great victories of settler colonialism in North America is the concept of the noble savage, right? The idea that from Canada to Central America to South America, people lived in little tribes, all in harmony with nature, not touching and not interfering with it, right? And what I tell folks, while there were folks that lived like that, right, it was actually much more complicated. There were people who had complete domination in a different, more harmonious way with their environment. And they lived in organized societies, many of which were very much urban. My ancestors achieved this authentically indigenous urban lifestyle, essentially without domesticating animals. Cities were built around and for humans outside of capitalism, outside of the invisible hand of the market, right? They were urban areas of hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people, right? I love this quote because it really emphasizes just how things were back then, right? Central Mexico was one of the most densely populated places on Earth, with more than twice as many people per square mile than China and India, right? Something that I think for a lot of folks is very shocking, because they tend to think, again, of these small little tribes of folks living in small villages, moving from time to time. And again, some folks were like that, but the bulk of folks were living in very urban areas. And to highlight just how urban, I want to highlight this. So one example of this urban indigenous location is today's Mexico City. It was founded in the early 1300s as Mexico Tenochtitlan. When Cortez, the Spanish conquistador, arrived, about 200,000 people lived there in the city proper. In the surrounding areas, it was probably closer to 1 million. But it was by far, at that time, the largest city in the continent. There were other cities, right, in other parts of Mexico and Central America. There were other cities all the way up all the way out to St. Louis, Cahokia, right? So there were cities throughout the continent. But again, it was very urban, right? It was built in the middle of a lake. It was roughly the size of a district, supervisorial district in San Francisco, roughly the size of Albany here in the East Bay. And it was about twice as dense as San Francisco. I like to imagine, I like to think that there were children who lived in these areas who really never left what we would consider to be an urban area, right? Were these people vegan? No, they weren't. But the very concept of veganism really didn't exist. There was no need for that because you didn't have domesticated animals the way we think of them, right? If folks had cattle, if folks had a dog, right, that was about it. There wasn't factory farms. There wasn't the old McDonald farm sort of vision. And that's because when Native North Americans think about agriculture, it was really within this agroecological system, really in some ways similar to what we think of as permaculture, but ultimately with no animal input beyond human labor. It included more complex systems, like up here in California, of silviculture, taking care of forests, but many of them in Central America, all the way up here, revolved around the milpa. It's something called in North America, in northern North America, the Three Sisters, the corns, the squash, and the beans. And it was this application of a manageable and sustainable system that permitted these very dense urban environments to exist, right? The ecosystems that people lived in had been intervened on for millennia, but in a very knowledgeable and responsible way by the folks living here in North America. They had a long tradition of using plants and landscapes to ensure that agriculture was not the origin of inequality, right? And this is something that really has only been learned on recently. And I'm going to show you these two graphs because to me they're some of the most compelling graphs that have ever been published in terms of social organization and inequality. They were published, I believe, a couple of years back. But the top graph shows, in terms of absolute dates, right, the inequality, right? So blue is the old world, so principally Europe, but some parts of Africa and East Asia. And then red is the new world. And the bottom graph is looking at it relative from the invention of agriculture and the location. And the conclusion that these researchers had was that we saw a decrease of inequality in urban spaces in North America. And we saw an increase of inequality in the old world. And very explicitly, they place the emphasis on the domestication of animals and how their profitability, their commodification, and the development of a mounted warrior elite, right, that allowed the expansion of empires led to essentially proto-capitalism and imperialism, right? Really, I can't imagine a more compelling narrative to place a lot of the blame on what we're dealing with today on a very simple to understand institution like animal domestication. And the example, of course, that we have in North America of a counterexample, I should say, of civilizations that developed without all of this, that saw that decrease in inequality in urban spaces, principally. And why is this important? Well, because we're dealing with things like this. We're dealing with these, at this point, annual fires here in the Bay Area, to say nothing of the hurricanes that are going through. But it doesn't even have to be that tragic. It can be very mundane sort of situations, this fossil fuel-based economy, and a way of living that has shown itself not to be sustainable. The challenge is that a lot of folks who oppose this, it's difficult to present a vision, to present an idea of how we could reorganize our world so that we could have the comforts, right, of modern life, while at the same time avoiding these sort of situations. And that's why I like to highlight to folks, well, we have the example of these urban areas, urban spaces in native North America and potentially in other parts of the world that allowed people to have urban lifestyles, but not end up with these sorts of situations. But it was these urban spaces that were sustainable based on ultimately the liberation of animals and founded on what we like to call veganic farming, right? And that's a lot of the work that Seed the Commons does, right? There are 46 commercial veganic farms in the United States. They are, in my opinion, the closest examples of pre-Columbian agriculture that really allowed urban centers to exist without this level of dangerous inequality. But these farms lack institutional support, principally because they're not plugged in to the systems of inequality that exist, like grazing, right? They don't use manure, so that means that they don't get the support of different levels of government that place a lot of emphasis on supporting the grazing and that sort of thing. So that's what Seed the Commons, what we try to do. We try to create the resources for them. We try to build visibility for this sort of vision and to counter the myth, the very dangerous myth, in our opinion, that grazing is a solution or even has a place when we're talking about addressing our environmental problems. One of the frustrating things, definitely worrying things that we see is that support of this idyllic old MacDonald farm, right? The idea that we need to have these regenerative grazing spaces, right? Without recognizing or even confronting the fact that ultimately all it's doing is perpetuating a system that we know doesn't work and that inevitably in the long term will aggravate inequality. We see veganic farming as a way to really reorganize our way of life in a truly sustainable way that will address our environmental problems, and the only real way that we can have sustainable agriculture. So I think I went through it a little bit fast, but if you want to learn more about our work, we have seedthecommons.org. If you want to learn specifically about veganic farming, we have a specific website, veganic.world. And if you want to support the work that we're doing, that's the website right there. And I'd be happy to open it up to questions, see if anybody has anything they'd like to say or anything they'd like to add, right? It's both a history lesson and I think a challenge to think things differently. So we're based in San Francisco, and we do do a lot of work there with community-based organizations that do things around urban gardening. Again, we don't have the resources to be involved directly into the farming or anything, but we do support their work around making sure green spaces exist for urban residents, and ultimately promoting that vision and that education aspect for folks. The question was, what additives do veganic farmers add to their land to make sure that it's productive, if I understood the question correctly. And this goes back again to the way we think of farming, right? When you have a horse or a draft animal pulling a plow, you essentially can farm the same thing, sow the same sorts of seeds in a big field and not worry about mixing, right, things. And that's where you really need to have that additive. And when you are adopting veganic farming methods, it often means that you do have to look for compost of plant origin, or things like, I'm imagining sort of leftovers from the production of beer, to add additional nitrogen. Traditionally, though, the systems, in specific the milpa, right, which I showed here, right, has the corn growing alongside the beans, alongside the squash, and they all together work to create a more sustainable system that might not completely eliminate the need for additives, but it definitely reduces it significantly with the pulses fixing the nitrogen. And in fact, it was recently, within the last 6 months, that they discovered a variety of corn, of maize, in central Mexico, in Oaxaca, that fixes nitrogen itself. Right, a very interesting situation where, again, indigenous farmers, because it was in a very small indigenous town that they found this corn, they had developed the technology, the specific type of corn that had eliminated even the need to have these pulses, these beans, right? So it depends really also on the environment. Beyond the milpa, there is another even more intensive agricultural model in central Mexico called the chinampa, which is basically growing on top of compost piles, right? Which again eliminates the need for additives or minimizes it greatly. So as I mentioned, the chinampa, the very intensely agroecological system that they had. So the question was how people fed themselves in Mexico City before the arrival of the Spanish. So Mexico City at that time was famous for these floating gardens, these chinampas of floating compost piles where they could grow multiple crops throughout the year, right? And my understanding is that that was a big component of what people ate, but also due to the fact that they had developed the corn, that they had developed a lot of these plants to essentially exist in an agricultural, in a civilization that didn't have horses. So think about our avocado, right, that's coming in from Mexico, trucks, perhaps even airplanes, right? Back then, if you didn't have an avocado tree next to your house, it needed to be walked by somebody from perhaps 100 miles away. So you needed to make sure you had varieties that resisted that transport to Mexico City. Corn is a great example because it wasn't milled into flour, but essentially sent in the form of grain to then be cooked on site, right, once it arrived to people's homes. Same thing with beans. Again, easily transportable. Certainly enough where a few folks could walk it to their home from, I don't know, a farm nearby or a milpa nearby. Mexico City was was famous for the size of its market, right? I believe it was called bigger than the market in Constantinople and Istanbul. So very, very well-developed system of trade and network. They're essentially the same graph, just the scale is different. So the top graph is, again, in absolute dates. starting out from like 10,000 BC all the way out to the present day. The lower graph is more interesting, and that's really what you should be paying attention, because that is from the relative invention of agriculture at a specific site. So we see that the Gini coefficient that I mentioned earlier is the standard measure of inequality. I'm trying to see. So here we see the red, different areas in North America, all the way out to Teotihuacan, and then urban areas up in the old world, places in China and the Middle East, so forth and so on. And you can see that the coefficient is increasing until it essentially becomes a hockey stick when you look at the old world, right? That rising inequality, the large imperial states that only existed because of horses and draft animals that allowed people to impose their will on others. While on the other end, we see this gentle decrease, right? At the very least, a stability of inequality within urban centers in North America. And again, that's mostly because when we think even of the Aztec Empire, what I like to remind folks is that without any horses, you really couldn't impose your will on your neighbors very effectively, because it meant that you had to go and walk to them or get an army to go and walk to them. And if they were a couple hundred miles away, it wasn't a very effective system. So it was more of a tributary relationship as opposed to go and wipe out a village or a town nearby, right? So that led to examples like Teotihuacan, where Teotihuacan is near Mexico City. The ruins are famous for having some of the largest pyramids in the world, but definitely in North America. There's no signs of any palaces. There's no signs of any even noble homes in this area. So a city of probably 250,000 people in the 500 AD, so about 1,500 years ago, that apparently didn't have what we tend to think of as inevitabilities of power, right? Imagine a San Francisco without City Hall, right? That's what Teotihuacan was, right? And again, some variation, but the trend was for it to be decreasing. So hopefully that explains it better. So you're totally right that veganic farming is it's not visible at all in farmers markets. If you go to stores, you might see brands like 1 Degree Organics that often is veganic, although not always. And here in the Bay Area, there is Lazy Millennial Farms out in Salinas that does have a veganic CSA, which I encourage you to subscribe if you're able to, right? Basically, you're supporting a small farm that is oriented towards veganic agriculture that's local, and you're guaranteeing supporting a small farmer. But Lazy Millennial Farms and ultimately, if you want to learn more, go to veganic.world. There we do have a map of all the veganic farms, commercial and otherwise, that we're aware of here in the United States. Come to our events. We do organize events where you have the opportunity to interact with and work and talk to farmers that are planting and growing food veganically. And I guess support us, because there aren't many organizations that are trying to organize these farmers across the United States around veganic farming and build those resources so that we can get more of these folks out there. And it's a question that we're often asked around things like regenerative grazing. So the question was, what is our thoughts or positioning on like the Marin Carbon Project, which purportedly sequesters carbon through the grazing of cattle, right? And this is often what we hear in terms of what grassroots groups, but even a lot of the mainline environmental groups are doing. Sierra Club is a great example. Even Greenpeace, they're advocating for regenerative grazing, right? And the way we see it, they're either ignorant of the true damage that cattle and grazing does to our environment, or they're actually in the pockets of the grazing lobbying, which, as you can probably imagine, is exceedingly wealthy and exceedingly powerful in the United States. Now, in terms of what our positioning is, I'm not going to eliminate the possibility that in a very exceptional sort of situation, limited environment, maybe it is better, right? A more effective form of sequestering carbon. But ultimately, in average and overall, it's not going to be better than, for example, a forest that can that can store megatons of carbon per square hectare, right? To me, that really is the truly compelling example. And again, when we look at it from a historical perspective, what in many places replaced the grazing land, what grazing land replaced, right? We know that forests are the most effective way of sequestering carbon. Is there a question? Yes. So the idea, or the summary of regenerative grazing, is the idea that we can have a sustainable form of grazing that will regenerate the land, to nourish the land. And some of the arguments around this, which I find a little bit in bad faith, but ludicrous, really, when you look at it, is the idea that by having cattle, you replace natural herbivores like bison. They seem to forget the fact that they often were killed to make way for the cattle, right? But the idea that you can have these specific types of invasive foreign grasses that will be eaten by these foreign invasive cattle that will then help the earth heal, right? And it's a very tempting idea, because I think in the mindset of a lot of folks, the vision of a farm is very powerful, and it feels very connected to the earth. And what we try to tell people is that no, it's actually a very destructive way of managing the earth, and ultimately the only reason why we have those, at least here in the Bay Area in North America, is basically through genocide and conquest, right? What we should be doing is finding ways to rewild the land, to turn back the land that is now being reserved for grazing to natural ecosystems, and to shift wholesale towards a plant-based diet that will have a significantly smaller footprint, and hopefully be able to address a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with, like climate change. That's a great question. So the question is the thoughts around inequality due to nomadic tribes like the Maasai, or in northern the Caribou. I'm guessing folks like living in northern Europe, the Suomi people, those sorts of folks that have the caribou. That's an interesting question, and a little bit controversial, right? My positioning is that these environments are very marginal, that have never really, and probably will never, support huge densities of population, if that makes sense, right? So if these communities are determined to continue these ways of life, even though they show themselves to be unsustainable, they're ultimately probably not harming a lot of space, and probably not going to be able to expand out quite a bit, right? What we're talking about is more kind of where 95, 99% of humanity live, and ultimately where 95, 99% of humanity is damaging the environment. Not these very small urban areas, rural areas that are in semi-desertic areas or northern tundra-like situations, right? Can I imagine that those sorts of ways can then expand? Absolutely. I could definitely have imagined caribou herders expanding out with caribou all the way out to the equator if given the opportunity. And this is more of a question of animal liberation, and why it's important to have a relationship that doesn't drive inequality like we've seen in the past. So learning from the past and making sure we don't repeat the same mistakes. It is. So it's essentially, I believe, a portmanteau of vegan organic, right? So the idea is that you will, of course, not be using genetically modified crops, and you will not be using pesticides, but then on top of that, you will make sure that you're not using animal inputs and basing the system on this unsustainable model. Thank you.